The Bibby Stockholm. I mean, is the government's policy on migration cursed?
Well, it certainly helps the government to appear that way because the operational implications of whatever the policy may be, whether it's taking people to Rwanda, whether it's putting people on a barge, whether it's having enough barges, etc., keeps coming under strain and difficulty. And with that being such an important part of the government's 5 pledges, they really want to do a good job. And if they can't do a good job, they at least want to be able to blame somebody else.
Well, yes, indeed. It would be good to blame someone else. But Legionnaires disease, some bacteria in the water. I mean, we'll be talking about this with a doctor later on, but it doesn't look good, and it's certainly not good for the people who actually got on to the Bibby Stockholm. There were people who refused to get on, and to me, that was the tail wagging the dog in this whole policy previously in the week.
Yeah, and this has been a problem for the government consistently. When you ask people who's best to deal with small boats, it's actually Labour who comes out on top of the Conservatives. And when you look at specific policies, and it doesn't really matter what that specific policy is, whether it's a barge or whether it's sending people to Rwanda or various other things, you get around about half of people supporting the idea in principle, and around about between a quarter and a third of people opposing, again, to the abstract principle. But then when the details start coming out, and details like this can be damaging in public opinion terms, people start to question, is it the right idea? And if they start to question, is it the right idea, they then think, right, well, has the government got control of this? Is the government moving in the right direction on asylum? And that's the really important point, because individual events and episodes and policies don't make much of a difference compared to the overall narrative, the idea that people have about asylum, and the government are really starting to lose the public opinion battle on that as we go into what could be a year until the general election.
And overall, Joe, of course, you're talking about the overall opinion on that. What about those sort of crucial people that the Conservatives want to retain, those who lent them their vote, as Boris Johnson said, in 2019? Asylum, presumably quite a big issue for those people. Somewhere, maybe not their top issue, that's probably cost of living or NHS, but is that going to factor into how they vote, whether they continue to vote Conservative or whether perhaps those red wall seats or the blue wall in the southwest go to Labour or the Liberal Democrats?
I would say a really good way of looking at this is looking at former Tories. So in other words, people who voted Conservative in 2019 but don't support the party anymore, because they represent, if you like, the swing voters, the lowest of low-hanging fruit for the Conservatives. And if they're going to win back anyone, it's that group that you would expect them to win back, as they are, as we see at the moment, so far behind in the polls. But then when you look at that group, you see that, yes, it's slightly more important. Asylum and immigration in terms of issues facing the country is slightly more important than it is for the nation as a whole. But it's so far behind the cost of living that it's almost to be irrelevant. And the NHS as well. And so you have the cost of living, the NHS, the economy in general, all ahead by some distance of compared to asylum and immigration.
But it is one of the 5 pledges, and it is in January. Rishi Sunak has said, judge me on my record, judge me on what's happening here. We'll talk about the NHS in a second, but in terms of stopping the boats, in terms of dealing with immigration, we've got the Supreme Court battle probably in the autumn about whether people can be sent to Rwanda or not. It's just not looking good for Rishi Sunak.
I think what is looking good for Rishi Sunak is the fact that it gets cold and it rains in the run-up to Christmas. And so inevitably during the summer months, we see greater numbers of people crossing the channel, and all things remaining equal, come the winter, we will see fewer people. The idea, however, that the boats will stop as a result of government action looks very, very distant at the moment.
And brings me to the conclusion that the election might be in May. What do you think?
I think that is definitely a possibility. I think the more likely option remains October or perhaps even November of next year, in order to get as much benefit from the Conservatives will hope an improving economic outlook.
Sure.
But anything is up for grabs. I don't think it's going to be this autumn, certainly.